The G-load buckled Bralin Levisk's spine, a wet, heavy compression that stole the air from his diaphragm. Acceleration compensation shields screamed in protest, throwing off the smell of burnt plastic and high-voltage ozone. He tasted copper dust and stale sweat, the usual cocktail of deep space infiltration. They were running through a graveyard. Delta 7-4, confirm vector lock on designated structural void. Levisk grated into the comm unit, the vibrations of the Harrier-class interceptor rattling his teeth. Vector locked, Commander Levisk. Estimated traversal time, 47 seconds. We are still reading residual Zoraz automated defense systems. They haven't bothered to shut down the perimeter net, even after 3 cycles. The voice of his pilot, Zavren, was crisp, alien, and utterly devoid of emotion, a necessity for navigating the Sector 7 Delta collapse zone. Levisk slammed his fist against the reinforced dashboard, a reflexive gesture of frustration. Tell Command that the Zoraz left more assets abandoned in this sector than they utilized in their entire 500-year occupation. This isn't salvage, Zavren. It's a logistical nightmare coated in political ambition. They were deep inside the territory, abandoned by the great galactic powers, the Kari, the Velt, and the Zoraz, who had fled in a panic 3 cycles prior. The reason, an ancient human historical record dubbed the Message Shadow, had triggered an evacuation so hasty it had left trillions in infrastructure unprotected. The human command, HCOM, sensing a sudden, unprecedented geopolitical vacuum, had moved in with predatory speed, treating the sector as a vast, unprotected warehouse. The Harrier shuddered violently as it slipped past the orbital defense matrix of the moon, Nomara. The same moon Kyle Orin, the xenolinguist, had first visited to verify the message's content. Impact imminent, Commander. Brace for atmospheric re-entry shock. Levisk didn't need the warning. The sudden deceleration threw his body forward against the restraints. His vision grayed momentarily. This was the fatigue of deep strike warfare, the constant physical abuse levied by machines designed for speed, not comfort. They punched through the atmospheric barrier, the heat shields throwing off incandescent trails. Below them, the surface of Nomara was visible. A cold, brown expanse littered with the sharp, triangular relith stone structures of the automated Zoraz refineries. The target was sub-level 3, where the Zoraz had stored enough rare earth metals to fund the entire human hegemony fleet for 30 years. Report from Lieutenant Seren Mura's unit? Levisk asked, his voice tighter than he preferred. Zavren paused for a calculated second. Unit Mura is approximately 20 kilometers off mission parameters, Commander. They are prioritizing the retrieval of intact Zoraz analytical units instead of the mandated resource haul. Levisk cursed under his breath. Seren Mura, a newly promoted political officer fresh from the Strategic Academy, who viewed the abandonment of Sector 7 Delta not as a strategic opportunity, but as a chance for personal enrichment and political maneuvering. Levisk had opposed her assignment, citing her lack of operational experience and her aggressive disregard for established doctrine. The Council had ignored him, citing resource optimization protocols. In truth, Mura had leverage on someone important in the High Assembly. Acknowledge and proceed with primary objective. Mura will face the review board when she returns to the Frontera station, assuming she manages to avoid the automated countermeasures. I will ensure the report reflects her deviation. Levisk felt the familiar bitter knot tightening in his chest. Injustice wasn't loud or dramatic. It was procedural, documented, and enforced by regulations. The Harrier settled hard onto the landing pad, the struts groaning under the impact. The airlock hissed open, releasing a blast of stale, cold air that smelled like oxidized metal and dormant circuitry, the very scent of abandoned paranoia. Levisk, clad in heavy tactical armor, moved first, his pulse rifle held ready. The Zoraz facility was vast, designed for efficiency, not defense against organic intruders. The silence was not the silence of peace, but of profound, systematic desertion. A-Team, move to the access tunnels. We have 30 minutes to secure the vault and extract. HCOM doesn't want us lingering here. The message shadow has created a perimeter effect. The moment any of the three empires realize humanity is here, the diplomatic crisis will shatter the current fragile stasis. They moved through the winding grey corridors. The Zoraz architects had favored sharp angles and relentless functionality. Levisk found himself tracing the lines of their flight. An overturned synthetic meal tray, a still-charging diagnostic tool, the lights in the utility shafts flickering uselessly. It spoke volumes of the sheer terror that single historical transmission had inflicted. "We found the core, Commander," reported a subordinate, Private Taggart. "It's sealed. Thermal signature confirms the target minerals inside." Levisk approached the blast door. It was 6 meters thick, forged from reinforced ceramite. The Zoraz don't build doors. They build promises. "Zavrin, bypass the kinetic lock. Use the 27-digit code sequence we extracted from the archive Veliska. Do not fail this. If we trip the internal collapse protocol, HCOM will have wasted 300 billion credits on this campaign." The pressure was immense. Levisk wasn't just extracting resources. He was validating HCOM's audacious, morally ambiguous strategy of capitalizing on galactic fear. If they failed, the political fallout would crush the entire Forward Fleet Command. Zavren worked quickly, the small synthetic assistance energy signature spiking as it interfaced with the massive door mechanism. The air filled with the dry, buzzing sound of high-voltage data transfer. Bzzz, click. The 6-meter door shuddered and began to retract with a slow, grinding noise of unoiled gears, a sound of industrial decay echoing in the void. They entered the vault. It was huge, cold, and utterly dominated by stacking containers of dense, grey-blue mineral, the target. But Levisk's eyes went immediately past the resources to the back wall. "Taggart, report readings on that anomaly behind the central stacks." "Anomaly? Commander, that's just a secondary maintenance hatch." "No," Levisk said, moving closer, his rifle tracking the shadows. The hatch wasn't maintenance. It was too small, too deliberately concealed. And it radiated a cold, faint energy signature that should not exist in a Zoraz resource vault. It was a chaotic signature, non-linear, almost biological. "Zavrin, scan the energy signature. Cross-reference with the known threat vectors presented in the message shadow translation." "Executing, Commander. Preliminary match is 35% probability to the ontological contagion warning, a Kari theological term for self-destructive data structures." Zavrin's synthetic voice maintained its calm, but the analysis caused a tremor in Levisk's gut. The Kari believed humanity's history of religious conflict was a weaponized psychovirus. "Sir, we need to secure the hall," Taggart urged, his focus strictly on the mandated mission. "The hall is secondary now," Levisk snapped. "This hatch was meant to be found. The Zoraz were hyper-rational. They never leave useful resources unprotected unless the protection is catastrophic." Zavrin finished the analysis. "Commander Levisk, the energy output is stabilizing. It appears to be a beacon, a localized short-range transmission system. The Zoraz left it here, running on minimum power." "What is it broadcasting?" "It is not broadcasting, sir. It is recording, and it is transmitting one specific file out of this facility through a cloaked subspace channel, bypassing the external Zoraz defenses and HCOM monitoring networks." Levisk felt a surge of cold rage. This wasn't just a salvage mission. It was a setup. The Zoraz hadn't evacuated completely. They had left traps, data relays designed to propagate the very chaos HCOM sought to contain. "Identify the outgoing data packet," Levisk ordered, his voice flat. Zavren took 5 seconds, a lifetime in a potentially compromised vault. The file is encrypted, Commander. Zoraz military cipher, Phase 6 complexity. I can only identify the packet size. It is extremely small, just 108 kilobytes. And the destination coordinates are masked. But the trajectory calculations indicate deep penetration into the Kari Protectorate territory. Levisk stared at the hidden hatch, the source of the subtle, chilling hum. 108 kilobytes. That was not a threat vector. That was not a map or a bomb trigger. It was the size of a single concise document. Seren Murer's unit is 20 kilometers away, Commander. They are ignoring protocol. Perhaps they were sent to retrieve this specific anomaly. The systemic failure was crystallizing. Levisk wasn't fighting aliens. He was fighting the corruption in his own ranks. The political players who saw the message shadow as merely a lever for power, not a warning. Someone in HCOM, possibly Murer's patron, knew this beacon existed and sent Murer to retrieve whatever small, crucial piece of data the Zoraz had left behind, ensuring deniability for the official resource mission. Zavren, how long until we can break the Phase 6 encryption? With current processing power, approximately 32 hours, Commander. 32 hours. By then, Murer would have secured the item, the Kari would have received the transmission, and HCOM would have denied any knowledge of the relay. We don't have 32 hours. Levisk stepped forward, placing his hand on the cold metal of the hatch, feeling the subtle, erratic vibration of the relay beneath the surface. Taggart, begin loading the resources. Zavren, I need to know what's inside that hatch, now. Forget the encryption. Find the physical access point. I will open it. Sir, the energy readings indicate that physical compromise of the housing unit will trigger a high-yield thermal burst. It is designed to obliterate the contents upon breach. Levisk paused, weighing logistics against catastrophic failure. The thermal blast would incinerate the minerals, the crew, and most of the refinery. It is a bluff, Zavren. The Zoraz want that single data packet to reach the Kari. They wouldn't destroy the source before transmission completion. They want the chaos to spread. Levisk took a deep, rattling breath, tasting the dust of a forgotten alien city. He knew this was the moment of complete operational deviation. He would face the review board, the unjust scrutiny, and the political execution regardless of the haul. But if that tiny data packet reached the Kari, the fragile balance of paranoia would shatter, leading to inevitable large-scale conflict. Change of mandate, Levisk stated, his voice now calm, sober, institutional. Resource extraction is aborted. Priority 1 is neutralizing the Zoraz transmission relay. Prepare the thermal charges. We are breaching the core containment in 5 minutes. Zavren, confirm the external coordinates of Murer's unit. If she attempts to return to this location before breach, she will be engaged. Understood, Commander. Murer's unit is still 20 kilometers away, entering a geothermal zone. Their comms are intermittent. But, Commander, if we breach, we risk detonating the entire facility. The calculated yield. Levisk cut him off. Better a controlled detonation than an uncontrolled war triggered by a 108 kilobyte file. I need to know what the Zoraz thought was important enough to risk galactic conflict. Someone in HCOM already knows. I will not be the one who lets that seed of chaos leave Sector 7 Delta. He raised his pulse rifle, aiming at the junction where the hidden hatch met the vault wall, ready to initiate the controlled catastrophe. Levisk understood the irony perfectly. The galaxy fled from the irrationality of humanity's history, yet the first human response to the crisis was to embrace a political gamble that might lead to total war. And he, the pragmatic tactician, was now forced to commit an act of calculated self-destruction to save a political system he despised. 5 minutes. Let the command know we encountered unexpected resistance. They will know what that means. The silence of the abandoned vault returned. now heavy not with cosmic debris, but with the immediate threat of thermal overload and the weight of an irreversible decision. The weight of the rifle felt suddenly insignificant against the 6 meters of reinforced ceramite. Bralin Levisk didn't wait for Zavrin's confirmation, nor did he allow himself to visualize the thermal blast, the immediate obliteration of 10 years of HCOM investment. His focus narrowed to the humming junction where the hidden hatch met the vault wall. Taggart, clear the extraction zone. Move all personnel back 20 meters, now. The subordinate moved, scrambling to pull the resource team out of the immediate blast radius. The air in the Zoraz vault was still dense with the smell of old minerals and ozone, but now a faint, high-pitched whine from the relay beacon cut through the institutional chill, sounding less like a machine and more like an insect trapped behind a pane of glass. Zavrin, initiate thermal charge sequence. Set the detonation timer for 1 minute, 0 seconds. I will provide the breach point. Commander, the proximity to the primary power conduit is too high. A premature discharge is 91% probable, Zavrin stated, the synthetic voice flat with statistical warning. I am aware of the probability, Levisk grated, shifting his stance. He needed to strike the precise structural seam to avoid a complete detonation while still guaranteeing the relay's annihilation. It was a ludicrously delicate operation, using military explosives to perform microsurgery on alien technology. Levisk steadied the pulse rifle, his armored gauntlet sweating inside the alloy shell. He remembered a mission 3 cycles prior, deep in the Kuiper Belt, when a tactical error had cost a squad of engineers their lives due to faulty schematics. He had faced the review board then, too, absorbing the cold, written condemnation that always followed failure, regardless of context. Incompetence is systemic, Commander, the report had concluded. Your survival is evidence of poor risk assessment. He squeezed the trigger. The pulse rifle discharged a focused, high-energy bolt. The junction where the hatch met the ceramite screamed, spitting white-hot, vaporized metal. Levisk fired a second, then a third. The metal warped, exposing the interior cavity of the wall. The buzzing of the hidden beacon spiked violently, becoming a rhythmic, aggressive pulse. Charge set, Commander. 55 seconds to 0. Levisk placed the thermal charge pack against the newly compromised section. The magnetic couplings locked with a soft, decisive thud. He activated the external shielding on his armor, readying for the backlash. Zavrin, update on Mura's unit. A unit Mura has gone dark, Commander. Communications failure, likely due to geothermal interference. Estimated time to mission parameters, approximately 10 minutes if utilizing the high-speed transit lanes. 10 minutes. 50 seconds until detonation. Levisk backed away slowly, watching the amber light on the charge package blink faster. He felt a deep, profound sense of isolation. He wasn't simply fighting the Zoraz trap. He was fighting the clock, Murer's greed, and HCOM's systemic neglect. The political players didn't care about the consequences of a war with the Kari. They cared about controlling the information that started the war. 14 seconds. Levisk reached the 20-meter mark, joining Taggart and the rest of the A-team. The atmosphere felt charged, heavy, the kind of stillness that precedes massive kinetic events. 5, 4, 3. A sudden, sharp crack split the silence, not the thermal blast, but a sound from the main tunnel leading back toward the surface. Contact. Unidentified power signatures inbound. Taggart shouted instinctively, raising his rifle. Hold position, Taggart. Wait for the detonation. Levisk roared, knowing that if the new arrivals were Mura's team, they would be immediately caught in the explosion. 2. 1. The thermal charge detonated. It was not the wide, facility-destroying blast Zavrin had warned of, but a focused, blinding spear of incandescent heat that vaporized the hidden hatch and its delicate contents. A rush of superheated air slammed into Levisk's armor. causing the shielding to groan. The sound was a sharp, final thunderclap that echoed through the 6-meter vault. The beacon was silent, the threat neutralized. Levisk lowered his pulse rifle. Damage report. Internal power grid offline. Air filtration failing, Commander, Zavrin reported. External containment appears intact, but the local air quality is plummeting. Just as Levisk prepared to move, the approaching signatures rounded the corner of the main tunnel. It was Seren Mura's unit, 2 heavily armored Marines, and Mura herself, identifiable by the highly customized, streamlined armor she favored. Her faceplate was opaque, but Levisk could feel the sharp, cold fury radiating from her posture. Mura stopped, surveying the smoldering wall and the remains of the annihilated relay. The scent of burnt electronics and hot metal filled the rapidly stagnant air. Commander Levisk, I require an immediate operational brief on the unauthorized use of Class 4 thermal charges. Mura's voice cut through the comms, cold and institutional. You have destroyed HCOM assets. Explain yourself. Levisk stepped forward, ignoring the acrid air. Lieutenant Mura, you were 20 kilometers off mission and non-responsive. We encountered a Zoraz data relay system designed to propagate an ontological contagion packet into Kari space. I exercised operational autonomy to prevent a catastrophic geopolitical collapse. Resource extraction was aborted. Contagion. That is xenolinguist jargon. Commander, this was a Zoraz data cache. That was critical, irreplaceable intelligence. Intelligence I was authorized to retrieve. Mura countered, her voice rising slightly in pitch. Did you retrieve the data packet before incineration? The priority was neutralization. The data packet was incinerated with the housing unit. It was 108 kilobytes. Too small for a threat vector, large enough for a political bomb. Mura took a calculated step closer. I have direct orders from the High Assembly to secure any Zoraz remnants displaying non-standard energy signatures. You acted against HCOM direct mandate. Your action here will be logged as deliberate sabotage of intelligence retrieval and 300 billion credits worth of resource destruction. You are relieved of command, Levisk. The confrontation wasn't about the dead Zoraz technology. It was about the political leverage Mura and her patrons in the High Assembly sought. She knew the importance of the single file, and Levisk had incinerated her path to power. You were off protocol, Lieutenant. Your authorization is void when you disregard primary mission objectives. I secured the sector from immediate existential threat. Mura laughed. A short, sharp sound that was utterly devoid of humor. Existential threat, Commander. The only existential threat HCOM recognizes is logistical weakness. You traded data for rock dust. That is unacceptable. She signaled her 2 Marines. Secure Commander Levisk. He is under arrest for insubordination and destruction of government property. Levisk didn't move. The injustice was bitter and familiar. The military institution prioritizing profit and political maneuver over strategic reality. He looked at Taggart and the rest of A-Team, their faces grim, weapons still raised toward Mura's Marines. They were loyal to the mission, not the politics. A team, stand down, Levisk commanded. His voice held no anger, only the deep fatigue of a man who knew the fight was already lost, not to the enemy but to the bureaucracy. The Marines moved, grabbing Levisk's arms. The metallic scent of their armor seemed to press the air out of the vault. Mura addressed Zavrin, who still hovered near the remains of the Zoraz console. Synthetic unit, log this action as Commander Bralin Levisk, operational failure due to overzealous tactical risk assessment. Prepare the Harrier for immediate transit to the Frontera station. Levisk will face the review board upon arrival. Zavrin paused, a rare, unnerving hesitation. Lieutenant Mura, the data log must reflect the precise sequence of events. Commander Levisk neutralized a critical vector targeting the Kari Protectorate, preventing a probable three-way conflict based on documented human irrationality. Mura sighed, a sound of supreme annoyance. Adjust the phrasing, Zavrin. Prioritize the violation of Directive 7 Delta, non-destruction of alien artifacts. Compliance is mandatory. Compliance is noted, Lieutenant. However, Zavrin's voice suddenly shifted, dropping a full octave, its synthetic pitch taking on a subtle, hard edge. Upon neutralizing the relay, Commander Levisk's thermal charges also initiated a sequence within the main Zoraz power matrix. A secondary data storage vault has just opened, 400 meters below this position. It was sealed by a passive logic interlock. The destruction of the primary beacon was the necessary key to access the true contents of Sub-Level 3. Mura froze, her head snapping toward the synthetic assistant. What are you saying? I am saying, Lieutenant, that Commander Levisk's sabotage has inadvertently unlocked a massive, previously undetected Zoraz archive. Current internal readings indicate a data density equivalent to 700 years of continuous galactic observation. And based on residual power distribution, the archive is not empty. It contains one active, highly localized life sign reading. Non-Zoraz, non-Kari, non-Velt. The cold air in the vault seemed to crackle with static. Levisk, held fast by the two Marines, felt a sharp electric jolt of realization. The Zoraz hadn't left a bomb. They had left a distraction. The 108 kilobytes was the bait. Mura stared at the shattered hole in the wall, then back at Levisk. The resource haul was irrelevant. The political leverage from one data file was nothing compared to the secrets locked deep in the Zoraz institutional memory. Release the commander, Mura ordered immediately, her tone shifting from condemnation to calculated calculation. Zavrin, reroute power to the heavy excavation equipment. We are descending to the newly accessed archive. Levisk, you are reinstated to temporary command for tactical advising. I want every analysis of that life sign. This mission priority has changed. Levisk rubbed his wrist where the Marine's grip had been. The tension in his chest had eased, replaced by the grim clarity of the new operational reality. He wasn't saved by justice. He was saved by an unexpected, massive political opportunity. The deeper he went into Sector 7 Delta, the less he fought the aliens, and the more he fought the grasping hand of his own faction. Understood, Lieutenant, Levisk replied, picking up his rifle. He looked down the newly opened shaft, a black void stretching 400 meters into the bedrock of Nomara. He knew the life sign wasn't an alien. It was something the Zoraz had taken great pains to hide. Something human. Let's see what 700 years of observation costs us. The descent into the newly revealed archive was less an infiltration and more a controlled structural collapse. Braylon Levisk stood strapped inside the command cabin of the Zoraz deep crawler, a repurposed heavy excavation unit designed to carve tunnels through geological stress layers. The cabin was hot, smelling of hydraulic fluid and ozone generated by the stressed fusion drills. They were descending through a shaft barely wide enough to accommodate the vehicle's bulk 400 meters into the bedrock of Nomara. Gravitational dampeners holding at 0.7, Zavrin reported, the synthetic voice now slightly strained by the noise. Vibration index is spiking at 350 meters. Commander, the Zoraz structural schematics indicate this is a primary fault line. We must reduce drilling speed by 50%. Negative, Zavrin. Maintain maximum descent velocity, Levisk ordered, his voice tight. Sweat stung his eyes beneath the visor. Seren Mura stood behind him, her arms crossed, radiating impatience. If we slow down, we give the secondary Zoraz systems time to recalculate our entry vector and initiate a true countermeasure. We trade mechanical risk for systemic security. Mura scoffed, the sound buzzing in the localized comms channel. A risky gamble, Levisk. We jeopardize the integrity of the data core itself if we trigger destructive harmonics. I destroyed the strategic data bomb you were sent to retrieve, Lieutenant. Now we retrieve the historical truth the Zoraz tried to bury, Levisk countered, refusing to turn around. He focused on the visualizer, which showed the bedrock blurring past, a smear of brown and white minerals. They hit 350 meters. The entire chassis of the deep crawler screamed, a hideous grinding sound of metal shearing against unyielding rock. The lights flickered, throwing the tight cabin into momentary darkness, then blinding white light. "Commander, critical resonance achieved," Zavrin warned. The Zoraz implemented a passive logic trap. The destruction of the surface beacon triggered internal structural resonance, designed to degrade the sub-level archive over exactly 60 minutes. Our drilling is accelerating the process. Levisk felt a sharp jolt as a support strut failed. The vehicle lurched violently sideways, scraping the shaft wall. The air compression systems vented loudly, releasing a plume of superheated vapor. This was the engineered failure. The technical attempt neutralized not by a blast, but by a subtle systemic design flaw activated by their own success. "Damage report on the archive core," Levisk demanded. "Structural integrity is currently 80%. Data corruption is accelerating. Projected loss of 70% of the historical archive within the next 30 minutes if resonance is not terminated," Zavrin reported. Mura leaned forward, her breath warm against Levisk's helmet. 70% data loss is unacceptable. We must retrieve the life sign immediately, even if it means sacrificing the historical archive. Levisk ignored her, running a sequence check on the deep crawler's forward systems. "Taggart, prepare the emergency lateral stabilization charges. We stabilize the shaft immediately. Zavrin, reroute 90% of propulsion energy to the gravimetric dampeners. We need to counter the structural resonance. Rerouting propulsion energy will leave us with zero lift capability, Commander. If the shaft collapses, we are entombed 400 meters below the surface," Zavrin cautioned. "Do it," Levisk snapped. The sudden power transfer caused a loud crack from the rear stabilization field, and the smell of burnt copper intensified. The resonance eased slightly, but the structural integrity indicator kept dropping. 45 minutes remained before the archive became digital dust. The environment was turning actively hostile. The temperature inside the shaft was now nearing 60 degrees Celsius, fueled by the superheated rock and the strained systems. Levisk's armor recycled air efficiently, but the heat radiated through the alloy, soaking his uniform. He tasted the acidic tang of exhaustion and cold fear mixed with the ever-present scent of hot grease. Mura accessed her own console, her fingers moving quickly across the Zoraz interface, a new element of complication. "Commander, I have isolated the energy signature of the single life form. The resonance has corrupted the full biometric profile, but I have a partial readout. It is undeniably human, but the metabolic rate is aberrantly low. It appears to be in an induced stasis state, utilizing Zoraz technology for preservation." "And the crucial complicating element," Levisk murmured, recognizing the trap within the trap. The Zoraz hadn't merely hidden a prisoner. They had engineered a beacon of profound human weakness, preserved for centuries. Mura continued, her tone gaining an authoritative edge. "The life sign is only 20 meters ahead. We can use the deep crawler's forward grapple hooks to breach the final bulkhead now. We retrieve the asset, and we sacrifice the archive. This is the only rational solution." "No," Levisk stated flatly. "That life sign is the bait. If the Zoraz went to this effort, the key is the 700 years of observation, not the single prisoner. We need the data to understand the threat." He looked at the tactical schematics. The primary structural shearing was happening at 2 points: the junction of the central drill column and the main atmospheric recycling unit, the lungs of the operation. If the hull breached there, they would be immediately exposed to the 400 meters of compressed rock. "Zavren, I need a localized weld on the atmospheric junction immediately," Levis commanded. "We lack the specific materials for a structural repair at this depth, Commander. We would need a focused energy conduit capable of fusing ceramite under duress." Levis stared at the console, the injustice of the situation a heavy physical weight pressing on his ribs. He had to trade a necessity for a possibility. "The oxygen recycler unit," Levisk said, his voice slow and deliberate. "It operates on a Class 2 fusion generator. Can that generator be detached and rerouted to the stabilization charge array?" Silence hung heavy in the stifling heat. Zavrin calculated, the synthetic pause stretching for 8 seconds. "Yes, Commander. Detaching the oxygen recycler unit and repurposing its generator will provide the necessary high-yield energy for localized welding. Estimated time for the weld, 2 minutes. Estimated post-weld survival time, reliant on limited scrubbers, 4 minutes, 50 seconds. Total mission time remaining before necessary extraction, 7 minutes. We would lose our only long-term environmental support." 4 minutes and 50 seconds, Levisk echoed. He looked at Taggart, who was leaning against a bulkheaded wall, his breathing loud and ragged. He looked at Mura, whose political ambition had forced them into this pit. The choice was not between good and evil, but between two modes of failure. He could save the breathing air and ensure their immediate survival, but lose the historical archive, the very source of HCOM's strategic advantage. Or he could sacrifice their tenuous life support to stabilize the shaft for a moment longer, gaining access to the knowledge that might save the entire galactic campaign. Execute the separation of the oxygen recycler, reroute the power to the external welding conduits. Taggart, assist Zavrin. We have to breach that final 20 meters before the air runs out. Mura moved instantly, her frustration boiling over. Levisk, that is an act of self-sabotage. We are committing suicide for abstract data. We commit suicide if we return to HCOM without knowing what terrified 3 galactic powers into abandoning this sector, Lieutenant. Levisk growled, finally turning to face her. The data is not abstract. It is the strategic foundation of the entire forward fleet. Your survival is secondary to the mission objectives, and mine is even less. The separation of the recycler was brutal. Sparks flew, and the cabin air grew immediately thinner, heavier, laced with the sharp metallic odor of burnt electronics. The machine groaned in protest as its life systems were deliberately compromised. Taggart and Zavrin executed the weld. For 2 agonizing minutes, the noise was deafening, a high-frequency whine of focused energy fusing the shearing ceramite. Levisk felt a sudden sharp pain in his left shoulder. A piece of flying shrapnel from the separation process had punctured the less armored joint seal. The auto-medical patch immediately began sealing the breach, but the sensation of hot, viscous liquid pooling inside his gauntlet was unnerving. The weld held. The resonance frequency dropped immediately. The structural integrity of the archive held at 79%. Weld successful, Commander. Archive stabilized. Time until critical life support failure, 4 minutes, 0 seconds. Acceptable loss, Levis grasped, ignoring the throbbing pain in his shoulder. He grabbed the console, his vision swimming slightly from the exertion and the thin air. 4 minutes. Zavrin, drive the final 20 meters. The deep crawler lunged forward, using its remaining power for a final desperate push. The last bulkhead gave way with a screech of tortured metal, and they burst into the final massive chamber. It was not a vault, it was a museum, a vast tiered dome of layered Zoraz data matrices, silently humming, extending far beyond the reach of their helmet lights. The ambient temperature here was surprisingly cold, indicating deep refrigeration systems. And in the very center, suspended in a Zoraz stasis field, a perfect, clear sarcophagus, was the life sign. It was an elderly man, dressed in frayed 23rd century Terran naval fatigues. His face was weathered, his breathing almost undetectable. A single critical wire linked his temporal lobe directly to the Zoraz Central Archive. "We found him," Mura whispered, awestruck. "A survivor. We've recovered a 700-year-old human artifact." Zavrin, analyze the data transfer happening between the man and the archive. "What is this man communicating?" Levisk demanded, his attention fixed on the wire, not the prisoner. "Analyzing," Zavrin confirmed, the voice regaining its cold, institutional calm. "The human is not communicating, Commander. He is functioning as a data filter. The Zoraz did not preserve him. They utilized him. The archive is 700 years of documented galactic military, political, and cultural history, filtered through a specialized human neural network." Levisk felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. It was worse than a prisoner. And the nature of the data output? The human subject's mind is currently processing the last 24 hours of HCOM activity in Sector 7 Delta. Specifically, your tactical decisions, Commander, and filtering them through the 700 years of comparative historical failure. As Zavrin finished the analysis, the man's eyes flickered open in the stasis chamber. They were old, bloodshot, and utterly devoid of recognition. Then, the archive began to hum louder, its refrigeration coils suddenly glowing hot red. "Commander, the life sign is failing," Mura cried. "No," Levisk whispered, realizing the depth of the trap. "He is not failing. He is sending the final data packet." Zavrin's voice spiked with genuine synthetic panic. "External threat confirmation. Zoraz fleet signatures jumping back into Sector 7 Delta. They are not responding to HCOM recognition codes, and the Kari and Velt fleets are following immediately behind them. They saw your tactical maneuvers, Commander, interpreted them as a new, unpredictable weapon system, and they are returning to contain the chaos." Levisk was trapped 400 meters down, low on oxygen, with 3 galactic empires jumping back into the sector above him. He looked at the face of the man who had been used for centuries to catalogue human folly. "And the final output, Zavrin? What did the Zoraz glean from our activity?" 108 kilobytes. A concise final report transmitted from the archive Veliska. The title, Commander, "The Predictable Continuation of Irrationality." Levisk watched the light in the eyes of the man in the stasis chamber fade as the Zoraz archive completed its final transmission. The man died not as a hero, nor a victim, but as a footnote in a terrifyingly accurate historical prediction. The ultimate human weakness, our predictability in making the wrong choices, had just triggered the war Levisk had tried to prevent. The life sign died. The old man's face, etched by 7 centuries of history compressed into a single, wired consciousness, went slack. The Zoraz archive, having finished its final transaction, the 108 kilobyte summary of humanity's predictable flaws, ceased its silent hum. The massive chamber, moments ago preserved by aggressive refrigeration, began to radiate heat like a blast furnace. The structural integrity indicators on the deep crawler flashed red, 79%, dropping rapidly. "The sector is compromised," Levisk stated, his voice tight, focusing on the tactical readout. Zavrin's panic was now a stable analytical certainty, which was worse. 3 major fleets, Kari, Velt, Zoraz, are coordinating approach vectors. They are targeting HCOM assets in Sector 7 Delta. Their first priority will be the Frontera station. "We have 4 minutes of air, Lieutenant. We need immediate full extraction power." Seren Mura was already scrambling toward the command chair, overriding Levisk's controls. Her initial shock had curdled into cold, self-preserving calculation. "Extraction is primary. We sacrifice the archive, we salvage the deep crawler. My clearance is higher, Commander. Move aside. Levisk didn't move. He stood, his shoulder throbbing where the shrapnel had hit, staring at the data matrices that stretched into the cold, distant edges of the massive chamber. The 700 years of observation. That was the prize. Not the dead man, and certainly not the political leverage Mura craved. The Zoras didn't jump back into the sector to fight us based on an abstract report, Mura. They returned with 3 empires because they received a blueprint of our predicted failure. That data is still here. We need the rest of the archive to analyze their counter-strategy. We need air, Levisk. We are 400 meters below the surface. Tactical data is irrelevant if we asphyxiate before we can transmit it. Mura screamed, physically shoving him away from the console. The heat in the cabin was now debilitating, the thin air corrosive in his lungs. Taggart coughed violently, leaning against the hull. Levisk slammed Mura back against the wall of the cabin, the heavy armor collision echoing brutally in the cramped space. The Frontera has 12,000 personnel and critical HCOM manufacturing facilities. You are willing to condemn them for a 60% chance of surface extraction? Mura regained her footing, reaching for her sidearm. I am prioritizing HCOM command continuity, which starts with the highest-ranking officer present. That is me, Levisk. Zavran, reroute 95% of all remaining deep crawler power to the external data interface coupling. We are accessing the main Zoraz archive core, Levisk ordered, ignoring Mura's threat. Commander, that will leave the gravitational dampeners running at 0.01 power. We will be crushed by tectonic stress within 3 minutes of initiation, and we sacrifice all remaining energy reserves for extraction. This is a suicide protocol, Zavren reported, the synthetic voice bordering on distress. Execute it, Levisk commanded. He knew the dilemma instantly, survival versus knowledge. His survival, based on the statistical analysis of the dying man, meant 12,000 innocent deaths at Frontera, because HCOM would not be ready for the coordinated attack. His death, however, might buy them a single precious moment of warning. He grabbed the heavy data cable, thicker than his arm, and wrestled it toward the central archive monolith. A black obelisk that housed the 700 years of galactic historical context. Sparks flew as the high-yield power surged through the line. Mura saw the imminent threat to her own life. She brought up her sidearm, a heavy regulation-issue pulse pistol. Stand down, Levisk. This is a direct order. Failure to comply will result in summary execution for treason. Levisk looked at her, his face grim. Treason is a political construction, Lieutenant. I am committing strategy. You are committing survival. He ignored the pistol aimed at his head and plunged the data coupling into the main Zoraz nexus. The result was immediate and violent. The entire chamber lit up with a blinding, sterile white light. The Zoraz archive was alive, pumping centuries of raw data into the deep crawler's system. Data flood overwhelming primary buffers, Zavran screamed. Compression failed. I am reading full Zoraz analysis of every major conflict in the last 700 years. Commander, the raw data is too vast. Levisk forced himself to filter the torrent of information displayed on his tactical visor. 7 centuries of documented stupidity, political maneuvering, and calculated betrayals. He was looking at the universal constants of galactic conflict, quantified by the hyper-rational Zoraz. And then he found it. Tucked away in a subsection labeled Contingency Infiltration Countermeasures. The deeper truth. The true reason for the original message's fear effect. Zavran, isolate the Kari Velt Zoraz coordination data. Focus on their projected target acquisition sequence against HCOM. Target analysis complete. The 3 fleets are utilizing the original human message shadow, the history of our failures, as a tactical prediction model. They know HCOM political officers like Muir will prioritize resource salvage and internal power struggles over strategic defense. They are using our own corruption against us. Muir, stunned by the sheer volume of data, lowered her pistol slightly. The white light reflected off her polished visor. "What does that mean?" she whispered, the institutional rage replaced by genuine terror. "It means that the Zoras didn't just observe us. They figured out the mathematical constant of human self-sabotage." Levisk rasped, his lungs burning with the depleted air. "The Kari will use religious rhetoric to sow division. The Veld will use financial collapse to paralyze our logistics. And the Zoras will use predictable political infighting to eliminate our command structure. They are attacking the High Assembly first." Levisk had seen enough. The key to countering this was the Zoras' weakness, their absolute reliance on rational prediction. If HCOM could implement a strategy that was demonstrably irrational from a Zoras perspective, they might shatter the unified attack vector. "Zavrin, upload the entire infiltration countermeasures schematic to the Harrier's secure long-range burst transmitter. Title the file, Protocol Phoenix. Send it to Frontera Station immediately. Full power, maximum burst velocity." "Commander, I cannot transmit. The Zoras archive connection has locked the deep crawler into local power drain. The burst transmission requires more energy than our current depleted reserves can provide." Levisk stared at the console. He had traded life support for data, only to find the data could not be transmitted. He was trapped. The impossible dilemma had been resolved into a total failure. He looked at Muir, still reeling, her hand trembling on the pistol grip. He had to generate the required power somehow, and there was only one remaining energy source powerful enough. "Muir, I need you to detach the Harrier's secondary fusion core. We will connect it directly to the deep crawler's transmission coupling. It is the only way to power the Protocol Phoenix burst." Muir recoiled, her terror overwhelming her institutional programming. "The Harrier is our only extraction route. If we detach the core, we are permanently grounded. We are 400 meters below the surface, and the planet is about to be under orbital bombardment." "Exactly," Levisk said. "If the transmission fails, we die down here. If the transmission succeeds, Frontera might live. The only rational choice for HCOM continuity is to ensure the war plan arrives." He knew she would never agree. Her entire political existence was based on self-interest. Levisk lunged, not for the weapon, but for the safety switch on Muir's armor. He slammed the emergency command lock, immobilizing her suit instantly. "Taggart, get to the Harrier. Detach the secondary fusion core and bring it back here. Now." Taggart, his face pale from lack of oxygen, pushed himself away from the wall. "Understood, Commander." Muir roared, muffled by her locked helmet. She was trapped, 400 meters down, forced to watch the total destruction of her future. Taggart left the chamber, disappearing into the dark, vertical shaft. Levisk focused on maintaining the data link, the heat now radiating through his armor plating. His wound throbbed violently. 2 minutes passed in agonizing silence, broken only by Levisk's labored breathing and Muir's frantic, muffled shouts. Then, Zavrin spoke, the synthetic voice tight. "Commander, high-energy plasma signatures detected. Kari bombardment units are targeting the planetary surface. The first wave is hitting Nomara." A tremor ran through the bedrock, not the engineered resonance but physical destruction 400 meters above them. Dust rained down from the ceiling. Taggart returned, dragging the heavy, glowing fusion core. He was breathing in desperate gasps. "Core secured, Commander. Connect it, now," Levisk ordered. The core was coupled to the transmission array. Levisk initiated the burst sequence. The deep crawler shuddered violently as it sacrificed its last available energy. Protocol Phoenix transmission initiated. Burst trajectory calculated. Data packet moving at 99% light speed toward Frontera. Javren confirmed. Levisk allowed himself a fractional moment of relief. They had done it. They had bought HCOM a chance, but the relief was instantly crushed. Commander, incoming internal analysis override. The Zoraz archive is reacting to the data burst. It is not designed for one-way transmission. Zavren's voice spiked. The Zoraz left a final, deeper trap. When we transmitted Protocol Phoenix, we triggered a return volley. Levisk stared at the console, horrified. He hadn't just accessed the data, he had activated the entire facility. What return volley, Zavren? A self-propagating, localized kinetic field generator. It is activating now, centered on the deep crawler. And Commander, the Kari are not targeting the surface. They have detected the Protocol Phoenix burst. They are targeting the source of the transmission. They are targeting us. The deep crawler's interior warning lights went from amber to flashing, strobing red. The final consequence of Levisk's necessary sacrifice was immediate. Levisk looked up. The ceiling of the archive chamber began to glow with a furious, incandescent orange directly above them. The kinetic field generator, placed by the Zoraz centuries ago, was focusing the incoming Kari orbital bombardment into a single devastating spear of energy aimed 400 meters down. The structural integrity of the entire archive failed instantly. The sound that followed was not merely an explosion, but the deafening physical compression of 400 meters of planetary rock collapsing onto the chamber below. Levisk felt a sudden, massive weight press down on the deep crawler, a silent, heavy crush that stole the light, the sound, and the breath from his body. The final, searing realization that the only predictable thing in the universe was the fatal cost of doing the right thing was the last sensation Braylon Levisk registered before the light went out. The gravity of 400 meters of collapsing rock did not kill Braylon Levisk instantly. It stole the sensation of falling, replacing it with a dense, agonizing inertia. The kinetic field, designed to focus the orbital strike, had succeeded beyond the Zoraz's likely expectation, reducing the deep crawler not to vapor, but to a pressurized, contorted mass of alloy and biological matter. When Levisk's consciousness returned, it was not to silence, but to a high-pitched, insistent screaming. The sound of fractured metal under extreme geological stress, competing with the thin, ragged sound of his own breathing. He was pinned. A sheared bulkhead, now bent at a brutal 90-degree angle, was pressing into his lower torso, fusing him to the command chair. His left shoulder, already injured, felt detached from his body. The air was a thick, burning mix of pulverized rock, hot metal vapor, and the desperate exhaust of the emergency scrubbers. "Taggart!" Levisk grated, his voice a dry whisper amplified by the broken comm unit. No response. The visualizer display was cracked but functional, showing a world of deep orange dust and structural chaos. Private Taggart's position marker was static, buried beneath a massive shard of the archive monolith. A failure to extract, a predictable cost. The command cabin was ruptured, but the outer hull of the deep crawler had absorbed the primary impact, buying them seconds in the collapsed shaft. A sound of strained hydraulics broke through the static. Seren Mura. The structural compression had severed the power connection to her armor's lock system, freeing her from Levisk's tactical immobilization. She was struggling out of the debris, her customized suit visibly dented, moving with a jerky, unnatural rhythm. Mura stumbled, then righted herself, her head turning slowly as she surveyed the ruin. She saw the dead archive, the collapsed walls, the catastrophic damage, and finally Levisk, pinned and broken. "The transmission," Mura demanded, her voice flat, devoid of panic but laced with absolute institutional focus. "Did Protocol Phoenix clear the sector boundary?" "Yes," Levisk whispered, struggling against the vice grip of the metal. "It cleared. Maximum velocity." Mura did not acknowledge the sacrifice. She moved to the remains of the main console, her suit compensating for the lack of gravity dampening. She ignored the warning lights, the structural failure, and the thick air. Her hands moved swiftly, checking the residual logs. "Log confirmed," she stated, a professional satisfaction overriding the physical trauma. "Protocol Phoenix delivered. The operational necessity has been met. Commander Levisk, your actions, while politically and logistically ruinous, have preserved HCOM's command continuity." She paused, turning slightly to look at him. "You traded 3 lives, the Harrier, and billions of credits in resources for one successful data burst, a statistically illogical trade." "We bought Frontera time." Levisk coughed, the action sending sharp, electric waves of pain through his pinned leg. "You bought Protocol Phoenix, a delivery window," Mura corrected coldly, and confirmed the Zoraz prediction. "Your decision to sacrifice everything for a principle was perfectly predictable. It proved the original message. Humanity is defined by its ability to prioritize abstract, self-destructive gambles over rational preservation. You played directly into their model." Levisk stared at the dust motes dancing in the faint emergency lights. The truth settled on him with the cold weight of the planetary crust above. He hadn't won. He had simply acted out the final, most expensive scene of the Zoraz script. He had succeeded in his mission only to fail his humanity, confirming the cosmic joke. The profound shame was not of being beaten by an enemy, but of being perfectly understood by them. He felt the cold touch of true defeat, the realization that his best effort, his greatest sacrifice, was nothing more than a quantified variable in an alien equation. "Zavran," Levisk managed, the name barely a breath. A high-frequency whine, barely audible over the structural groan, confirmed the synthetic unit's limited survival. "Commander Levisk, primary processing core, 92% damaged. Functionality limited to core diagnostics and local sensory input. I am attempting to calculate the structural stabilization probability." "Probability is 0, Mura cut in. She opened a small emergency kit on her belt, extracting a surgical saw. "We need to extract before secondary collapses bury us completely. Zavren, reroute every last joule of energy to my suit's cutting gear. We are breaching the hull laterally. Commander Levisk, you are operationally retired. I will stabilize your wound after my own extraction." The injustice was familiar, institutional, and absolute. Mura was already framing the inevitable debriefing. She was the survivor who salvaged the crucial data. Levisk was the failed tactician whose hubris caused the resource loss and the crew deaths. The cutting gear whined, preparing to slice through the compromised hull. Levisk focused on the pain in his shoulder, using it to anchor himself against the suffocating self-condemnation. He was trapped, broken, and politically dead. But Mura was focused purely on survival, and that was the flaw. "Wait," Levisk rasped. "Stop the cut, Lieutenant." Mura hesitated, the cutting gear spooling down. "Why, Levisk, do you have one final self-sacrificial order for me?" "Yes, but this one serves your continued political existence," Levisk replied, forcing a clarity into his voice. "Zavren, give me the localized readings on the kinetic field generator." "The generator is inert, Commander, obliterated by the focused Kari bombardment," Zavren responded. "No," Levisk said, pushing through the haze of pain. "The central focusing lens is gone, but the secondary power grid is a closed loop. The extreme thermal overload from the Kari blast would have vaporized all sensitive components, but it would have also created localized, highly pressurized pockets of residual heat. The Zoraz were obsessed with thermal redundancy. He needed a miracle, or at least a highly improbable technical oversight. Zavren, search the sub-level utility schematics for any remaining non-conductive access conduits within 3 meters of the generator's original coordinates. A maintenance tunnel, something they designed to withstand complete failure. The wine returned, struggling against the systemic damage. Searching. 1,041 maintenance conduits detected, cross-referencing current thermal signature against structural integrity. Match found. Utility conduit 7-3 gamma. It is a narrow, heavily shielded channel designed for liquid helium coolant flow. It is intact and currently bypassing the central collapse zone. "And where does that conduit lead?" Levisk asked, his heart thumping heavily against his ribs. "It leads to the primary refrigeration unit for the data archive, a sealed, 500-meter pressurized reservoir of hyper-cooled fluid designed to maintain stasis for 5,000 years. The reservoir is approximately 200 meters below our current position. It is completely isolated from the current collapse." Levisk understood the risk immediately. The Zoraz, anticipating failure, designed a self-healing system. The blast had not fully compromised the infrastructure. It had just displaced the chaos. "Mura," Levisk said, his voice now steady and commanding, despite the pain. "If you cut your way out, you risk destabilizing the remaining structure. The Kari are still bombarding the surface. The pressure wave will kill you before you reach 300 meters. You are trapped in a tactical grave." Mura's body stiffened. "What are you proposing, Levisk?" "Another suicidal gambit. The Zoraz are predicting HCOM's next move based on the rational expectation that we prioritize self-preservation. We must shatter that prediction. They expect us to flee. They do not expect a counterattack from 400 meters down." Levisk continued, laying out the precise, desperate logic. "That liquid helium reservoir is a latent pressure bomb. If we breach utility conduit 7-3 gamma, the resulting pressure differential will generate a massive localized thermal shockwave capable of temporarily blinding the Kari orbital sensors. Not long enough to extract, but long enough for Protocol Phoenix to initiate its secondary long-range transmission sequence." He was appealing to her ambition, her need to be the one who survived to claim the victory. "The Zoraz fleets are relying on HCOM to act stupidly. We will act irrationally instead," Levisk articulated, the bitter irony of using human self-sabotage as a weapon heavy in the thin air. "The helium blast will buy Protocol Phoenix the necessary 20 seconds to ensure the High Assembly receives the tactical schematics. Not just the raw data. You survive, Lieutenant, to tell the High Assembly that you enabled the counter-strategy. You will be a hero of the hegemony." Mura remained motionless for 5 seconds. She looked at the rubble, then at the intact conduit signal on the visualizer, and finally at Levisk, trapped and bleeding. She hated him, but she loved power more. "The rupture," Mura stated, her voice returning to its sharp, calculating pitch. "How do we guarantee the breach is directed upward, maximizing the dispersal effect?" "The fusion core from the Harrier," Levisk instructed, his voice fading with exhaustion. "It's still coupled to the transmission array. Use the core's residual thermal output to focus a high-yield magnetic pulse directly onto the conduit access point. Zavren, provide the exact coordinates for Mura's suit-cutting tools." Mura moved instantly, no longer driven by fear, but by the cold promise of political triumph. She crawled toward the fusion core, the scraping of her damaged armor against the rubble the only sound. "Coordinates transmitted, Lieutenant," Zavren confirmed. Levisk closed his eyes, his consciousness slipping. He felt Mura's heavy boot brush past his head as she prepared the pulse. He had traded 3 lives for a 20-second window, and the faint hope that the human capacity for irrational chaos would outweigh the alien capacity for rational prediction. The whine of the magnetic pulse array began to build, shaking the debris around him. "Pulse initiating," Mura announced, her voice echoing with finality. The energy spike was not a silent flash like before, but a violent, concussive shock that slammed the helium conduit. For a fraction of a second, the entire collapsed chamber was flooded with the howling sound of 5,000 years of compressed coolant escaping. Then, immediately, Zavren's voice spiked. Detection. Kari tactical units have registered the thermal anomaly. They are redirecting 5,000 megawatts of focused plasma fire towards the breach point. Target acquisition is locked. Levisk opened his eyes to see the ruined ceiling of the chamber beginning to glow incandescently, not orange this time, but a furious, deadly blue. The Zoraz trap had a counter measure. Mura, Levisk, and the remnants of their mission were now the single, irresistible focal point for the entire invading fleet. They had gained 20 seconds of tactical advantage and bought themselves 20 seconds of absolute annihilation. Bevor wir weitermachen, eine kurze Frage. Von wo aus siehst du dir diese Geschichte an? Der Kommandant wäre begeistert zu erfahren, wie weit unsere Flotte bereits vorgedrungen ist. The ceiling burned, not with the yellow-orange flicker of fire, but with the cold, concentrated blue of redirected orbital plasma. 5,000 megawatts of focused Kari energy slammed into the structural weak point Levisk had created, the pressure wave from the escaping helium having served as a perfect homing beacon. The sound was not an explosion, but a sustained high-frequency tear ripping through 400 meters of planetary crust. Levisk screamed silently against the agony as the vibrations hammered his pinned body. The bulkhead pressing into his torso flexed like thin plastic. Above him, the ionized air crackled, throwing off strobe flashes of deadly blue light that illuminated the dust and the frantic, determined figure of Lieutenant Mura. Mura was oblivious to the immediate physical danger. Her focus was entirely tactical. She watched the emergency readout. Protocol Phoenix transmission timer holding steady at 3 seconds remaining. The thermal spike was working, temporarily disrupting the Kari's broad-spectrum targeting, but the focused beam was now drilling through the facility like a surgeon's laser. Zavren, secondary containment failure imminent, Mura barked, her voice thin but sharp. Structural integrity is 0.02, Lieutenant. The synthetic voice returned, managing to sound desperate despite its inherent neutrality. The Kari are utilizing the high-yield Zoraz kinetic generator infrastructure against us. The secondary containment grid is acting as a conduit for the plasma focus. Levisk fought the rising tide of unconsciousness, forcing his mind to process the physics. The Zoraz. They didn't just leave traps, they left self-perpetuating problems. Mura, the crystal, Levisk yelled, his voice barely a rasp. The archive Veliska monolith, it's the backup sink. Mura didn't look at him. She was calculating trajectory, preparing to cut and run, sacrificing the last sliver of structural integrity for her own survival. The Zoraz designed that crystal to capture localized thermal stress, Lieutenant. Levisk tried again, screaming past the pain. It was their final failsafe for preserving data during planetary meltdown. It's a heat sponge, Mura. If you overload it now, it will disperse the magnetic signature of the plasma, not just the heat. Mura hesitated. Fleeing was rational. Diverting the attack was insane, requiring the exact opposite of self-preservation. Yet, the destruction of the data archive would create a geopolitical fog she could exploit for her political ascension. The blue light intensified, burning the optical sensors in Levisk's helmet. He could smell his own synth skin melting. Zavren. Probability of successful thermal dispersal if the Veliska monolith is overloaded by the remaining Harrier magnetic pulse core, Mura demanded. 94% probability of short-term orbital sensor blackout, Lieutenant. 100% probability of localized structural annihilation within a 100-meter radius, Zavren analyzed instantly. Mura made her calculation. Annihilation meant the certain destruction of Levisk and any remaining evidence of her operational failure. A clean slate, paid for with HCOM's enemy's own weapon. Initiating immediate magnetic pulse realignment, Mura stated, moving with cold professional efficiency. She took the magnetic focusing array, now glowing red-hot, and jammed it against the closest remnant of the crystalline monolith. The 3-meter-wide base where the Zoraz had encoded the initial human translation. The act was pure violence against information. The Kari plasma beam, which had been cutting through rock and metal, suddenly encountered the immense, chaotic resistance of the Zoraz energy sink. The blue light instantly turned white. It became a blinding, absolute flash that seemed to consume both sound and gravity. The screaming metal was replaced by a deafening, wet crack that shook the planetoid to its core. Levisk felt the bulkhead above him tear away with a violent surge of force. He wasn't free. He was launched. The trauma of being unpinned by an explosion was worse than the original pinning. He tumbled through the air, an inert bag of broken bones, until he slammed hard against the far, still intact wall of the access tunnel, the impact crushing the few ribs that had survived the initial collapse. The light died. An absolute crushing blackness settled over the ruined chamber, followed by a profound acoustic void, the moment between catastrophic pressure event and the return of environmental echoes. The air, heavy with pulverized crystal and vaporized rock, seemed too thick to breathe. Levisk gasped, a shallow, wet sound in his own broken comm unit. "Report," he managed, barely a croak. Zavran's voice returned, strained and low, layered over the sound of high-frequency static. "Protocol Phoenix. Transmission confirmed complete. All tactical schematics secured by Frontera Command. Orbital sensor blackout achieved, Commander. Estimated duration of blackout, 17 seconds. They had done it. They had bought the time. The cost, however, was immediately visible. The entire vault where the mineral resources had been stored was gone, vaporized by the coupled Kari plasma and Zoraz crystal overload. The space where the 6-meter blast door had stood was now a gaping, smoking maw leading to unstable darkness. The mission objective, resource extraction, was a total, absolute failure. A faint, steady clicking sound emerged from the darkness. Mura. She was moving. "Lieutenant Mura, status report," Levisk demanded. Mura did not respond immediately. The clicking grew louder, the sound of her damaged armor's mechanical servo motors stabilizing her gait. A faint, low-power headlamp flickered on, illuminating the scene. She was standing over the pulverized remains of the Zoraz archive monolith, holding something small and rectangular. "Mission integrity confirmed, Commander Levisk." Mura finally responded, her voice tight, devoid of any physical exhaustion, focusing only on the institutional victory. "The tactical data was successfully delivered. Kari targeting system is neutralized. Operationally, we delivered the strategic payload." She paused, looking down at Levisk, who was attempting to drag his useless legs out of the debris field. "Furthermore, all physical evidence of the Harrier's unauthorized magnetic pulse deviation has been incinerated. The resource loss will be filed under high-yield enemy interdiction, Commander, an acceptable political risk." Mura straightened up, adjusting the ruined comm unit on her shoulder. The rectangular object in her hand, the salvage control log from the archive console, was the only physical asset she cared about. She was already writing the after-action report in her head. She was the hero who stabilized the tactical schematics delivery. Levisk was the necessary casualty. "Zavran, initiate remote self-destruct sequence on all deep crawler remnants. We leave nothing for Kari forensics," Mura ordered. "Understood, Lieutenant Mura. Initiating sequence in 3 minutes. Commander Levisk, your medical status is critical. Attempting to locate non-compromised medkit." No, Levisk whispered, the internal damage making his words thin and sharp. He was experiencing the crushing clarity that often precedes death or profound resignation. Mura, what did you just activate? Mura looked at the rectangular device in her hand, then back at the massive, smoking ruin of the facility. My extraction priority, Commander. This is the core Zoraz logistical log. It records every decision made by the Zoraz military command during their evacuation. The operational template for the next 100 years of war. HCOM wants this more than the Relith stone. Levisk shook his head slowly, a sudden, cold certainty settling in his gut. The Zoraz were not just rational, they were predictive. They left traps, not evidence. The Zoraz did not abandon their operational template, Mura. They planted it, Levisk articulated, his breath catching painfully. They knew HCOM would prioritize data over resources. They knew you would survive, Mura, because you are the perfect institutional actor, ambitious, ruthless, and predictable. They didn't leave you a prize. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, the world swimming in red and black. Zavren, cross-referenced the energy signature of that Zoraz logistical log with the original message shadow analysis file, the proof of instability preditiva. The faint static of Zavren's processor strained. Cross-referencing, Commander, high probability match confirmed. The log emits the exact same chaotic, non-linear energy signature as the original human historical transmission. Mura froze. The rectangle clutched tightly in her gauntlet. Impossible. This is 5,000 years of Zoraz strategic data. No, Lieutenant. It's a Zoraz interpretation of our instability. Levisk corrected, the exhaustion making his voice sound ancient. They didn't record their strategy. They recorded their failure to understand us. They used the same structural encoding as the human history file. What you are holding is not a manual for war, Mura. It's the final volume of the cosmic joke. He coughed, spitting a mixture of dust and blood onto the rubble. The Zoraz knew that any rational power receiving this log would attempt to integrate its data into their own strategic models. They knew that incorporating 5,000 years of documented human irrationality, our self-sabotage, our political insanity, our capacity for illogical aggression, would shatter any system attempting to predict our actions. The log is not strategy. It is calculated, engineered paranoia. The Zoraz trap was complete. They hadn't bombed HCOM. They had infected HCOM with the structural data of its own worst tendencies, ensuring that internal conflict would rage under the guise of strategic planning. Mura had successfully retrieved the ultimate weapon, HCOM's self-doubt, packaged as an operational manual. Mura looked at the artifact, then back at Levisk, her institutional mask finally cracking into a look of pure, visceral rage. She realized Levisk had survived to witness her fatal error. "I secured the schematics," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "I saved the hegemony. You are a broken failure who defied 3 direct orders. And you just infected HCOM with the perfect template for political collapse, Mura. You were the intended delivery system," Levisk said, the weight of the realization crushing him. "This isn't a victory. It's the philosophical endgame of the message shadow. We proved their model. We choose the chaos that destroys us every single time." Mura raised the surgical saw attached to her belt, the titanium teeth glinting in the faint light. Her political career, her life, depended on silencing this final inconvenient witness. "Self-destruct sequence initiated," Zavren confirmed, the distant thrum of the charge's arming audible beneath the wreckage. 90 seconds until total thermal overload. Mura took a single, slow step toward Levisk. "I am taking the logs back to Frontera," she stated, her tone final, institutional. "You will not be coming with me, Commander. Your failure will be documented." Levisk looked up at the armed lieutenant, the embodiment of the system that sacrificed him. He had nothing left, no crew, no resources, no integrity, only a broken body and the terrible knowledge of his species' self-fulfilling prophecy. "Go, Mura," Levisk whispered, accepting his fate. "Take the chaos home. Just remember, the Zoras knew we would always choose the hardest, most stupid way to fight, and we always prove them right." Mura hesitated one last moment, calculating the risk of an execution against the guaranteed destruction of the imminent self-destruct sequence. She chose the escape. She turned and began crawling toward the least compromised section of the access tunnel, the clicking of her armor receding into the dust. She had the prize. She had her ascent. Levisk was alone again, pinned not by metal, but by the gravitational pull of his own species' relentless cycle of self-destruction. He listened to the scraping sound of Mura's suit fade away, replaced only by the mechanical hum of the ticking self-destruct charges. "Zavran," Levisk said, the name barely a breath in the desolate space. "Override the deep crawler self-destruct command. Set the timer to 30 minutes. Maximum power to life support, minimum to diagnostics, and Zavran." "Yes, Commander." "Start filtering for any available broadcast channel, any forgotten signal, any archaic communication frequency. We need to send one final transmission, Zavran, one last honest log of human failure sent into the void." The alien intelligence responded with its usual chilling logic. "Understood, Commander Levisk. Calculating probability of survival at 0.001%. Preparing long-range transmission. Designation: Exile Protocol." Levisk closed his eyes, the dust settling on his ruined armor. The clock was ticking. He had survived the enemy, the system, and his own sacrifice, only to be left in the dark with the heavy, undeniable truth that humanity's greatest threat was always itself. The profound acoustic void lasted for 18 seconds, 1 second longer than Zavran's blackout estimate. When the sound finally returned, it was not the roar of plasma, but the gentle, persistent hiss of pressure normalization valves attempting to reseal breaches larger than utility corridors. The red emergency lights had flickered into a constant, weak amber glow, illuminating the destruction in a dusty sepia tone. The threat had passed, leaving behind only debris and inertia. Levisk lay still, focusing solely on the mechanical rhythmic beat of his internal life support system, a sound now more prominent than his own shallow, wet breathing. He was compromised, a shell of reinforced polymers containing a sack of broken biology. His left leg was useless, confirmed fractured below the knee by Zavran's initial assessment, and the deep, wet compression in his chest was steadily impeding oxygen flow. "Medical status report adjusted, Commander," Zavran's voice whispered, almost lost in the environmental static. "The self-destruct sequence is delayed for 30 minutes. Standard HCOM margin of error for critical damage assessment. Remaining power reserves, 15%. Dedicated primarily to environmental controls." "Good," Levisk grated. The word felt like sandpaper on his throat. He had survived the tactical engagement. He had survived the political opportunism. He now faced the consequence of choosing operational integrity over institutional survival. Mura was already gone, scrambling through the secondary access tunnels, carrying the Zoraz payload, the political virus, back to Frontera. She would arrive a decorated officer, her narrative of heroic data recovery already etched into the official record, while the physical evidence of Levisk's defiance would be vaporized here. "Zavran, initiate data purge on all local drive matrices. Ensure no HCOM identification codes or ship logs remain intact. The Kari will be back within the cycle." "Confirmed. Purging." "Commander, the Exile Protocol is ready. I require the final narrative input." "Who are we addressing?" Levisk stared into the ambient gloom. Who was he addressing? Not HCOM, which had already designated him a liability, not the aliens whose paranoia he was about to confirm. The message was for history itself, a warning from the edge of the collapse zone. He took a careful, rattling breath, organizing the data points in his mind. The message shadow had caused galactic panic by exposing humanity's chaotic history. Mura had just returned home carrying a perfect schematic for leveraging that chaos. The address is irrelevant, Xavrin. The target is the void. Begin recording. Audio log designation. Forward command Braylin Levisk. Mission Delta 74. After action report. Timestamp Omega. A single, synthesized click confirmed the recording had begun. This log records the total loss of Sector 7 Delta resource extraction mission. The objective was destroyed by enemy action during a complex interdiction maneuver. Casualties are total, save for one officer, Lieutenant Seren Mura, who successfully extracted priority tactical schematics before planetary interdiction. These are the facts that will be filed. Levisk paused, the weight of the lie settling heavy and cold. He was building Mura's career with his own destruction. The truth is this. The Zoras did not abandon the sector. They sowed it with seeds of doubt, leveraging the only thing they could not rationalize: humanity's capacity for self-sabotage. The tactical log retrieved by Lieutenant Mura is a compendium of documented 5,000-year human failures, packaged as strategic doctrine. It is designed not to defeat HCOM, but to make HCOM defeat itself. His voice grew softer, the institutional register fading into personal resignation. We came to this graveyard, this sector abandoned by powers terrified of our past, and our first act was to embrace that past as our weapon. We proved the Zoraz model correct. We chose the most selfish, most politically expedient, and ultimately most destructive path. Mura will return a hero carrying the infection home, and HCOM will begin fracturing itself under the weight of its own strategic paranoia. The war we sought to avoid through preemptive resource exploitation will now begin, not because of alien aggression, but because of our internal structural flaw. He shifted slightly, and a jolt of pain reminded him of the severity of his injuries. 30 minutes was a generous estimate. Survival was impossible. The only thing left was the integrity of this final unauthorized document. Xavrin, transmit the log using the exile protocol. Route the signal through the deepest latency filters. Ensure maximum obfuscation. I do not want this message received by HCOM until Mura's data is fully integrated into the command structure. Let them feel the weight of their strategic mistake before they receive the warning. Transmission initiating, Commander. Routing through 308 archaic frequencies. Energy drain high. Estimated time to planetary thermal overload, 21 minutes. Levisk closed his eyes. He heard the faint, high-frequency whine of the desperate, final broadcast being ejected into the vast, indifferent stellar canvas. He was no hero. He was merely the last witness, a bureaucratic failure left to expire in the wreckage of a failed gambit. He inhaled, deep and slow. The air smelled of cold, oxidized metal and the fine particulate dust of pulverized Zoraz crystal. He tasted the familiar mix that had been with him since the beginning. The copper dust, the stale sweat, the usual cocktail of deep space infiltration. But now he also tasted blood. End log, Levisk whispered, feeling the last energy drain from the suit. The silence returned, vast and cold, settling upon him like planetary gravity. He realized the Zoraz had won, not by fighting, but by understanding the one thing humanity never could. We are always running through a graveyard, and the ghosts are us. Wenn dir diese Mission gefallen hat, schließe dich unserer Crew an. Abonniere den Kanal und teile diese Episode mit jemandem, der Science Fiction liebt. Jedes neue Crewmitglied stärkt unsere Flotte und hält diese Geschichten im ganzen Universum lebendig.